will vote to override the president's expected veto before heading home. For more on how the 9/11 victims and families feel about the possibility of a veto, we turn to former White House counsel Jack Quinn, who is one of the attorneys representing the families. Good evening, Jack.
Good evening.
Well, what about this pushback? It's really hard from a lot of both sides of the aisle. Former national security officials saying this jeopardizes U.S. national security abroad.
It's absolutely untrue. It is absolutely untrue. JASTA is an incredibly narrowly tailored statute that actually has nothing whatsoever to do with the liability of individuals, be they diplomats, service people, or any other employees of the government. JASTA has only to do with foreign governments, not individuals.
This suggests, the letter from these former national security officials, including one we'll talk to in just a minute, suggests that it undercuts sovereign immunity protection, from which the United States and all sovereign nations have lived under for centuries.
Also false. Completely false. JASTA is built on a rich history in the area of sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity in modern times is not an absolute. The world, states across the globe have important exceptions to sovereign immunity. The common exception that applies here is the so-called tort exception, which makes a government subject to the jurisdiction of another country if that government is complicit in causing death, injury, or property damage in that country. That is not an uncommon thing. In fact, in the administration that the judge served in, the Bush administration, not only was the law of this country characterized as allowing, as recognizing the tort exception, which it does statutorily, but indeed, the Bush administration went into court and said that that exception would apply to terrorist actions like 9/11.
You're a Democrat.
I am.
What do you think about the president of your party, President Obama, vetoing this bill? And what are the 9/11 families saying about this back and forth?
Well, the 9/11 families are incredibly distressed that he would veto this. And by the way, all of these arguments put forth by the judge and his colleagues, put forth by the administration, put forth by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, these are arguments that have been put out there for 6.5 years. This bill did not come on the scene a month ago. This has been working its way through the Congress for almost 7 years. It has been passed by the United States Senate unanimously twice, reported out of the Judiciary Committee unanimously in the Senate 3 times. It enjoyed unanimous support in the United States Senate. It enjoyed unanimous support in the United States House of Representatives. These arguments were taken into account, and in fact, the statute as a result of these arguments was very carefully tailored. It does not apply to military operations. It makes a very careful distinction between acts of war and acts of terrorism. And let me make this point. The conflation, the confusion that the judge and his colleagues and the administration make between what the United States does to prevent terrorism and what other countries do to support terrorism is a very dangerous proposition.
And you're confident the veto will be overridden?
I am absolutely confident it will be overridden overwhelmingly.
Jack Quinn, thank you very much. Now for the other side, we turn to the judge. Jack was referencing Judge Michael Mukasey. He's former U.S. Attorney General in the George W. Bush administration. Joins us live from New York. Judge, you've been listening to Jack. Your response?
Well, let's start with the fact, with the claim that we're conflating what we do with what terrorists do. I think that's not the issue. The issue is whether foreign governments would conflate what we do with what terrorists do, and they've already shown that they're inclined to do that. Governments as diverse as Belgium, Spain, Afghanistan have tried to bring lawsuits against us and against our diplomatic and military people based on sovereign acts that the United States took. Look, the United States has more people overseas than any other country in the world. More diplomats, more military people, more intelligence gatherers. And we have the most at risk from the notion not that another country is going to do the same thing as was done in this bill, but rather that they're going to use this as the excuse to undercut sovereign immunity and go after not only us, that is as a government, but our diplomats, our military people, and our intelligence gatherers.
Judge, respond to the criticism from 9/11 families and others who support this bill that this is only designed to really protect Saudi Arabia, that this is about the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and preventing embarrassment for what may have been funding for the 9/11 attacks.
No, this is about an attempt to essentially extort a settlement out of Saudi Arabia. These people want to get into court based not on a determination by our government that there is a possibility that Saudi Arabia was involved here, because there's been no such determination.
Well, you know the back and forth of the 28 pages that recently became declassified, but there's large sections of it that are still blacked out. Largely pointing to some kind of connection with someone in Saudi Arabia tying to the 9/11 terrorists.
I dispute that there are large sections blacked out. I've read the 28 pages to the extent they've been released. And what they show is contact between people involved in 9/11 and some low-level diplomats in the United States. That doesn't show Saudi government involvement. There's a huge difference between saying that these people had contact with diplomats here of an undisclosed kind and saying that the Saudi government was involved. There's not a shred of evidence pointing to that. And if there were, then there was already legislation that exists that allows our government to make a determination that Saudi Arabia was involved in an act of international terrorism, as we have in the case of Iran.
All right, now
and
quickly,
to allow people to sue.
For some lawmaker who's getting ready to override the president's veto, and it looks like, Judge, they have the votes, both sides of the aisle. You have House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi supporting this and others. What do you tell them in the final pitch that somehow gets them to change their override of this veto?
What I tell them in the final pitch is that we all have sympathy for the 9/11 families. We all want to see them get whatever is coming to them, and perhaps a bit more. But we also want to make sure that the United States is protected, that we don't hurt ourselves in an effort to try to help the families. And in fact, this isn't going to help the families so much as it's going to help lawyers like Mr. Quinn and other trial lawyers who have been pushing for this legislation for years. This legislation went through the Senate. He made it sound as if it received intense consideration. It didn't. There were no hearings in the Senate, and there was a one-morning hearing in the House.
But it was 7 years. I mean, and it did come out of committee.
It had no hearings this time around.
Well, Judge, we appreciate
None.
your time. Fair and balanced discussion tonight. Jack Quinn, thank you. Next up, the All-Star